This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Santa Cruz, and Salinas. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers, and it is program number 832, November 16th, 1987. Before the program begins, I want to say the views expressed here are those of myself or my guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of KAZU staff or board of directors. We want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you the following hour of World Watchers. The following hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. And again, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers, number 832, November 16th, 1987. The large trial, one of the largest trials that has ever taken place in the history of justice, or whatever you call it, just opened up this week in Italy. That is the Stibaum trial, the connections of Tommaso Buscetta, the well-known figure of the P2, of Banco Ambrosiano, of the Italian mafia, with his interconnecting links to Syria, to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where Joseph Mengele was identified as dealing drugs with Klaus Barbie. And this network is something that David Emery and Nip Tuck have had on their station, KFJC, for several years, calling it the Mediterranean merry-go-round. And I've been talking about parts of this particular event, the arrest of the Stibaum connections, Henry Arsan, the Syrian who died in jail in Italy, and the connections of these people, particularly to the administration of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and a good friend who translates the Italian newspapers for David and myself called this afternoon and said the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, it was their November 6, 1987 issue, described the very first day of the trial, and the first defendant evidently up or described in the newspaper is Rossano Brazzi, the Italian singer. He was in South Pacific, a close friend of Ronald Reagan and Frank Sinatra. And the Italian newspapers are saying Rossano Brazzi, defendant, has been accused of using his acquaintances in the film world, including Ronald Reagan, to trade arms to Israel and Somalia. And so Ronald Reagan's name is being linked the very first day. In this trial, he has had close relationships. They started very early, but the people that Reagan's in touch with now are indeed part of the Buscetta network. Also, Tommaso Buscetta, in addition to his Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Palermo, Italy, and the narcotics traffic, the guns for drugs, and exchanging guns and drugs, and offices in the Banco Ambrosiano in Italy, the Stibaum offices. In addition to all that, he links to the Syrian, as I say, the Syrian narcotics traffic, the fascist element there, and money, big hunks of that money were deposited through E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch in New York City and put into those banking houses at a time when Donald Reagan was chairman of Merrill Lynch, and he went on to become Secretary of the Treasury and chairman of E.F. Hutton until this year when the scandal kept blowing up, was Scott Pierce, Barbara Bush's brother, the brother-in-law of George Bush, and the crime reports of New York City by Judge Kaufman several years ago that came out in 1981-82, named these institutions that these men were part of, and that's known as the Pizza Connections, the mafia money in the United States. This is a very complicated group of network of really guns and space weapons, atomic bombs to be sent to the Middle East. And also Brazzi was connected, or is, with Robert Vesco, who then links and connects to the Iran-Contra defendants and the Medellin cartel in Colombia, the cocaine cartel. So this is a worldwide network of guns and drugs that includes the intelligence community and even very close relationships to the banking elite that are in the Reagan administration. This morning on television early news about 7:15, There was a discussion of the Graham-Rudman bill that goes into effect this Friday. And William Simon, former Treasury Secretary, Energy Czar under Gerald Ford, got on the television and said the people must bite the bullet, that the money that it will be cut from the Graham-Rudman has to be those people who have the Social Security and the Medicare. William Simon was included this year for the first time in the Fortune 500, among the richest people in America, with his wealth being at least over is the word, 200 million. And he is in charge and part of AmeriCares, the group that have been funding the Contras, active with them. He's a Knight of Malta, and he's the equivalent of John Singlab with the military. He is the general upfront man that has the connecting basis to a lot of this roving fascism that I talk about over and over again. And William Simon is in charge of the Olin Foundation money to disseminate the profits out of warfare weapons and guns that we're supplying, among other things, the Shah of Iran and the Savak. And Albert Hakim got money from William Simon and the Olin Foundation to come to California when the Shah was overthrown to buy international imaging that had been set up by Waffen-SS Otto von Bolschwing. So it's very interesting and consistent with that mentality that William Simon works with, that he's up there cutting the money from the people who don't have it, instead of charging all of us 2 cents more per gallon of gasoline, which would bring in, I understand, $20 billion a year. They want to cut the poor, and that's consistent with the background of William Simon and everybody he's been with. And the expression "bite the bullet" was so crude, considering the profits he keeps accruing and merging banks. He's buying up all these savings and loan banks that are going broke. It's actually very indecent to see him go after the poor, who are the people who shouldn't have to be cut the first time around. There's a series going on, a mini-series on television starting tomorrow night, and there's a book on this subject on the Kennedys. It's a movie called J. Edgar Hoover versus the Kennedys, the Second Civil War. And if you don't get a chance to see that Tuesday and Wednesday, there is a book out based upon this movie. Now, that title is particularly interesting because I've said over again that J. Edgar Hoover, again working with Heinrich Himmler and Interpol and those various agencies, and assisting the people from NASA like Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger and Division 5 of the FBI, his group, turned America to the South, to California, where we got President Nixon after Kennedy was killed and Robert Kennedy was killed. John and Robert were buried. And the presidencies of Nixon and Reagan and Jimmy Carter, and the power of the country, the real power, went to the South, to the armaments industries, to the aerospace, to those people that did not necessarily attend Harvard and Yale and Princeton, the northern elite that ran this country for so long. And once Kennedy's head was blown off, and it would be a natural place to have it in Dallas, Texas, with John Connally and Clint Murchison and the Hunt brothers and the gang that have been so powerful in directing this country since John Kennedy's head was blown off. The Second Civil War was won when Kennedy was killed, and the title of the series and the book is Hoover versus the Kennedys, the Second Civil War. There are some very good movies coming out soon for the holiday season that will be going on for a long time. A lot of publicity has been given to Cry Freedom. That is the story of the brutal death of Steve Biko in South Africa, and it is really to Mr. Attenborough's credit to make a movie over such a touching story, and it has to be told. It's been told, but enough people haven't seen it, and to his credit, he's made this very touching movie that will be out now. This past week, there was a program on television called Legacy of the Hollywood Blacklist. It was narrated by Burt Lancaster. And again, a very significant movie on people who lost their employment right after the war, starting in 1947, the writers and artists, and how the whole fabric of Hollywood was changed when these people were targeted and never able to earn a living. People like Adrian Scott, Michael Wilson, Dalton Trumbo, Sam Ornitz, George Wilner, and so forth. They had to change, use aliases, and never really enjoyed the freedom they had because they were making movies of social issues One was called Salt of the Earth, a film about social labor problems in the United States. And the MacArthur era was going after these people starting in 1947. Now, the important thing about Senator Joe McCarthy that isn't in these movies and isn't described is that as soon as he was elected in the Senate in 1946, he went immediately to Dachau prison to release prisoner number 33, SS Fritz Kramer. We have a Waffen SS in California, Otto von Bolschwing, who certainly affected and influenced the Reagan administration and the powers that be out here. And also, this SS Fritz Kramer suddenly disappeared when he was released from the prison. Oh, pardon me, I've got something in my throat. I'm just going to swallow there. So Senator Joe McCarthy is part of the whole fabric of the American Cold War against American people, labor unions, writers, artists, and Hollywood. But who is Joe McCarthy that he released these prisoners from Dachau? Pardon me. That is the real story of the Cold War, and people haven't yet faced that. The Christian Science Monitor had an article October the 15th, 1987, Lies About the United States, written by John Hughes. I won't go through all of these lies because each one is a subject that I've had on the air over and over again, and David Emery's had on his programs also. But John Judge sent me this because the most interesting lie the article cites is there are totally false stories that have emerged in some Nigerian newspapers charging that the United States used Israel to set off a neutron bomb in Lake Nyos area of Cameroon last year, in which thousands of Cameroonians were killed. And that is the very first article I'm going to be writing about with Barbara Honegger as soon as we get some articles separated. That is the hot story, and now it's circulating around Africa and Europe so much that the Christian Science Monitor has to negate the fact without saying why it's a lie. And I would challenge them to say that this didn't happen and where they're getting their information. Now, last week, I did part one on the nursery school in San Francisco where children were taken to the home of a man who's the head of a Satanic church. Today, as of today, November 16th, the Army has closed by this next Friday the U.S. child care facility that I talked about. They moved in very quickly and said that as many as 60 youngsters were sexually abused. But one man, Gary Willard Hambright, 34, a former worker at the center, has been charged with abusing only 10 boys and girls. With actually, there are 60 or more, and about 50 of them have venereal disease, but they're infants. So being as they're too young to testify, the man won't have to account for how these infants and children got venereal disease. But this gentleman, if you can call him that, who took these children, allowed them to be taken off the premise, happens to be a former Southern Baptist minister. And I think that it is scary to trust your church. And I cited before some material we learned in San Francisco that the churches are actually being used for these rituals. Almost 100 children were examined for physical or psychological signs of sexual abuse. As of this next Friday, the nursery school will be closed, but the problems won't be solved because so far the San Francisco police and the investigators are not touching Mr. Maurice Aquino, whose name came up and is very prominent in this particular case. Before I get on to him, I just want to share with you an article that was in the New York Times, December the 20th, 1986. Sex case accuser is discovered dead. The mother whose questions led to the preschool investigation of the McMartin preschool in Los Angeles was found dead in her home the week that this was written on December the 20th. Judy Johnson, 42 years old, her mental stability was questioned at the pretrial hearings. She was found in home in affluent seaside community of Manhattan Beach in California. She was expected to testify. At the time of her death, she was living alone and people were concerned. They didn't see her coming and going out of the house and broke into the house, and the body was discovered. At the time she was dead, Raymond Buckley was asking to be released from jail, and Mr. Bucky was relying on the past testimony of children in the case that this particular defendant said were threatened that they would be killed or their parents would be killed if they discussed the molestation case. Well, this woman had a child in the nursery school, and she was killed. So imagine the effect it would have on the children who were told that they would be killed if they discussed this particular case. And in fact, when you get one mother dead, and that mother was the one who insisted on the story being told, it gets even more scary. She wanted to testify, and she was the one who went to the Manhattan Beach Police in 1983. She alleged there was sexual molestation of her own son, 2.5 years old, and it was her charges that led to the arrest of the Bucky family and 5 other people connected with the school, and Mr. Bucky's mother, Virginia McMartin, and their daughter, Peggy Ann Bucky. And after this lady was killed, the charges were dropped against several people in the school. Judge Pounders ordered the current hearings after the defense in a motion to dismiss the case. They asserted the evidence about Mrs. Johnson, the murdered person, who became a prosecution witness in the preliminary hearing, was deliberately withheld from the defense by prosecutors. The defense wanted it thrown out, but the case was proceeding, and the New York Times said much of this came to light about the case when Glenn Stevens, a former prosecutor, and this is the really scary part of it, a former prosecutor in the case gave screenwriters Abby and Myra Mann information about Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson is the woman that forced the police to open the case. Now, I never trusted Abby Mann, the film director. He did a horrible movie on the Atlanta child killings, and he's making a movie, and the people are going to him, screenwriters, and telling him about a prosecution witness. The Manns are writing a book and a movie about the case with Mr. Stevens, formerly prosecutor, who turned the information about Mrs. Johnson over to them. This prompted a new hearing in the testimony, and Mrs. Johnson's mental case then came into question. Is she mentally sound as they proceed to write a book? And she opened the whole story up. Now, at the conference in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, or a week ago Sunday, there were people from the McMartin Nursery School who told terrible stories about this school. So Mrs. Johnson, the lady that went to the police, her name was turned over to the movie makers, the writers, the same writers that have fouled up the Atlanta story and a lot of other documentary movies. And is this the route you take, that so-called writers or under the cover of writers get this information, and then the primary witness is found dead? Now, Newsweek had a story about Mike Aquino, the gentleman I referred to last week. They moved much quicker than a lot of news stories do. Usually the story that broke in the San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle about him, it would take 2 or 3 years sometimes to get through the major media. But there's a picture of Aquino and his wife in Newsweek, November 16th, 1987. It's titled "The Second Beast of Revelation: Claims of Satanism and Child Molesting." And I want to share this with you to show you the part that Newsweek leaves out and some that they leave in. It's important. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, U.S. Army Reserve, has a face that might scare little children. I have sharply pointed eyebrows and a strong widow's peak, and I suppose I look pretty demonic, he said, as the leader of the Satanic church called the Temple of Set. The second beast of Revelation frightened some adults. And although he is interested in Nazi pagan rituals, which leaders of the Waffen-SS practiced during World War II, he insists he does not use little boys or girls in his worship. Now, this Newsweek article doesn't tell that he takes members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Heinrich Himmler's castle. And indeed, a little child doesn't have to hear about Heinrich Himmler's dagger or the Waffen-SS to be scared about being taken from a school into a home in San Francisco with all black walls and being put into a bed or a bathtub with dogs on it and crosses on the ceiling, and seeing men get into capes and dresses and so forth. What's scary isn't the Nazi rituals, but the fact that the children are taken there, and he says he's interested in the Nazi pagan rituals, but they don't tell you about how many military people are there or his expertise in mind control of what these children will remember later. He insists he doesn't use little boys or girls in his worship, and it's sheer coincidence that connected him to this bizarre allegation of molestation at the Presidio. He calls it a sheer coincidence, even though he was recognized by a child who described his home and the rooms and what happened to her. The scandal to which Aquino has been linked began last November when a 3-year-old boy said he was abused at the Presidio Daycare Center. Authorities found evidence of molestation, including 6 cases of sexually transmitted infected, I can't pronounce it, chlamydia, and in 58 children who had this disease. A civilian daycare worker, it's spelled CHLAMYDIA. A civilian daycare worker, 34-year-old Gary Hembright, who is a Southern Baptist minister, as that other article said, was arrested. And after charges were dismissed, Hembright has been reindicted on 12 counts of sodomy, oral copulation. The case took a bizarre twist when a 3.5-year-old girl spotted Aquino, and I mentioned that last week, and described the apartment and the walls and the cross and so forth. Aquino's wife, whose name is Lilith, the Newsweek called attention to this fact. Curiously, in medieval Jewish folklore is the name of Adam's first wife, who became a demon after the creation of Eve. Police searched the house and confiscated videotapes, photographs. They didn't say what they showed, and he is now assigned to the U.S. Army Reserve Personnel Center in St. Louis. And they also don't tell about his taking people from the NATO exercises in 1982 or his years in Vietnam with his expertise in mind control. Aquino insists he's innocent of molestation. I never met the child in my life, although it's interesting, and he can't explain how she described where he lived. He makes no secret of his leadership of Temple of Set. He has, according to sources, fewer than 100 members, and I don't believe that at all, including perhaps half a dozen of Aquino's fellow soldiers. Well, he's a lieutenant colonel, similar to Ollie North, and if he takes soldiers who are officers, I understand they're high officers, and he teaches, instructs the War College, and gives suggestions for mind control for the entire mass population. 6 people could change the course of history, just as 6 could with Iran-Contra, given free rein to do all the things they want. They said he is forthright about his group's beliefs and practices. In his writing, he prophesies a coming apocalypse in which only the elect members will survive. Now, that's the Jerry Falwell Armageddon philosophy that is taught inside the White House, that a very few will survive and all the rest are going to die. And I'm sure with his background in Heinrich Himmler and the Waffen-SS and his worship of the Nazis, you could expediently put a lot of people in ovens without waiting for the great beast of Revelations to come and all those biblical prophecies. You could help it along a little by getting rid of millions and millions of people. He says his interest in the occult rituals of the Nazis do not indicate sympathy for their policies, but he shows people with great pride and glee. His eyes light up with holding the dagger of the Waffen-SS, and he has these ceremonies to recreate what was happening at the Castle of Westphalia, where Heinrich Himmler was. So come on now, let's not believe this is a study of history. Then Newsweek says, whatever the superstitious masses may think of this, it hasn't hurt his career in the Army, which has known about his religion since 1981. That's 6 long years. Since that time, he was promoted from major and received a top secret. There's the top secret clearance. And he attended the National Defense University in Washington. He has an absolute constitutional right to his beliefs unless there is illegal behavior associated with it, said Major Greg Rickson. But the illegal activity is the sexual abuse of the children and taking them away and using them for whatever purposes they were used. and taking them off the premises. But if he isn't charged for that, then it isn't illegal. Then he can continue the other practices. If he were locked up for what he did or to have these children at his home, and maybe he will be, we don't know, then the illegalities come out. It's not what he thinks, but it's what he's practicing in preparation for what he believes that only the chosen, the kind that he wants, that believe in the demon and Satan, should survive. And he hasn't explained what he's going to do with the others. So this article concludes that the Army has the greatest child care center in the world. They're responsible for more than 90,000 children, and now they must guard against molesters, Satanic, Christian, or otherwise. So Newsweek did give a little bit of his story. Now, last week I listed a summary of parts of the Aquino story and the articles that they came from, and I want to continue with the details of those articles. Some have been in the summary, but I want you to see and hear how this has unfolded as a background for the kinds of activities that Heinrich Himmler had in Germany and the parallels and the desires of what this particular gentleman wants and has expressed that he wants. One large story, one of the first ones to come out, was October 30th, 1987, titled Satanic Sect Leader Linked to Presidio Daycare Probe. And the important thing about these articles is how they make apologies for him and skirt around getting to the hard facts of how did this child recognize him, and telling us what the police, or at least locking him up if there must be something in those videos and movies and tapes they took. And if not, explain how this child knew where those people when she saw them and could describe the place where she was taken. Now, this article from the San Francisco Examiner, just the highlights of the article, said San Francisco police are investigating Army Reserve officer of a satanic cult. The juvenile division inspector, his name is Glenn Pamloff, and he heads the search. He headed the search of the home that is linked to Gary Hambright, who's now been charged with these crimes. The police raided the home August 14th, owned by Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino and his wife Lilith, and seized 36 videotapes, negatives, photo albums, costumes, cassettes, masks, stars, and so forth, investigating child pornography and sexual molestation. And the search came from the complaint of people at the Presidio, the little girl who recognized this couple at the commissary. Michael Aquino now lives in St. Louis, Missouri. He's the high priest of the Temple of Set. And Glenn Pamloff of Juvenile Division said, and I quoted this last week, he could not see how his satanic cult of this Aquino could be involved, since it has worked very hard to be a decent, constructive, and responsible organization. And remember that quotation when I go into the interest of this particular gentleman and the questionable involvement of 100 children that have been checked. 58 have been molestation victims, and the indictment of Hambright is only for 10 children. They're not even going to bring in the mass numbers that have been sexually molested. The U.S. attorney, the assistant U.S. attorney, Robert Robinson, said that he will go ahead and prosecute Mr. Hambright April the 4th of this coming year, and that he was aware of the Aquino investigation, but that he has no intention as of yet, do the prosecutors or the FBI, and they are convinced that Hambright acted alone and Aquino wasn't involved. Now, we heard the FBI say that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and Sirhan Sirhan acted alone, and Jim Jones' operation was on his own. And we also know that J. Edgar Hoover worked with Heinrich Himmler through Interpol and the International Police until Pearl Harbor took place, and that men like Alan Dulles of our OSS were working with SS Karl Wolf and Heinrich Himmler. Those weren't considered crimes to be working with the top Nazis, the Gestapo, the Death's Head, the Order of the Death's Head during the war. So the San Francisco Police Department don't think it's a crime now that these same people have that ideology in 1987. The authority in San Francisco said the Aquino investigation, as far as they're concerned, is a lone person, and it doesn't involve more than one person. The Aquino investigation is the first indication to the public that it may involve more than one. The authorities say it is only one. And when this little girl, as I said, went to the house, she recognized it and the clothing and the people that took her there. She identified them. The San Francisco Examiner said the whole thing is pretty traumatic. And Aquino said the same thing. If they're upset, we are upset. And that he was willing to work with the authorities because he was sure that they would clear him of all matters. And as of this date, they have. He wouldn't say how many times he visited San Francisco since he left the Army Presidio. And he went to Washington to attend the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., to train to head up the Army Reserves. He's part of U.S. Army Reserve personnel in St. Louis. But he was in San Francisco in August when he was recognized, and he was there many times back and forth. Now, his explanation for, I got to notice it's the end of the half hour. I got a producer here. I would have got on that in 1 minute. His explanation for taking them to this particular location, his members of the Church of Set, was to show pictures of what he said were wax museum exhibits of the London Dungeon Museum, that people who went to his church were simply seeing wax museum exhibits of the London Dungeon. Can you imagine what that did to the little children? One or more who were taken to his house instead of going to London. He has duplications there, and that's what they would be seeing if they were there. I'll take a 1 minute break now. This is the end of the first half. At 8 o'clock is talk show, and at that time you call in and talk about things you want to share. I wanted to do a lot on Mr. Ginsburg, even though he was not appointed as a justice. I'll do that next week, and maybe during the talk show part of the program we can get some of that in, but I do want to get some of it on tape because he's a very, very important person, and because he was turned down so quickly, I believe was because more material would come out about him, not because the matter was closed regarding the pot. Now I'll continue with the second half of World Watchers and go into a case you just turned on during this first half hour regarding the nursery school in San Francisco, the sexual molestations, but they've been taking place all over the United States. And at West Point, there were satanic rites against small children. And the private nursery schools and the Army schools are having an epidemic of information of children being exposed to rituals, satanic rituals. So the San Francisco area is taking the lead only because a little girl happened to recognize a couple who were living in St. Louis, or this story would never have come out. And it may become a very large story if people understand the historical context. Otherwise, it will get buried. And already in the San Francisco Chronicle today, there was an article that Representative Barbara Boxer was getting too hysterical about this case. She should cool off, or it'll affect the prosecution. Well, the prosecution is getting off with 10 children and not 50 that were molested, and they're covering up the major part. The idea, keep quiet, we'll get a good prosecution, is ridiculous, because if you don't bring these things out, you don't bring them into the case and get a prosecution that's just at all. And if you bring it out too soon, they can say you ruined the prosecution. Either way, the intention is to let the major factors off and hit the Baptist minister, not the Church of Satan. So I hope this gets attention and continues to grow. The next article I want to share is from the San Francisco Examiner, a continuation rather of, this is October 31st, 1987, about the child abuse. It says the police and federal agents, although they received numerous reports of sexually molested children, many involved in bizarre cult rituals, they're taking this very slowly. There were children stuck with needles in parts of their bodies, people in costumes and robes, and Captain Paul Cota, the head of the juvenile division, said the case is so sensitive it could be jeopardized if details were released, but it's so sensitive it could be covered up if the details aren't told. U.S. Attorney Joseph Ruscinelli said the federal case of the Presidio children molestation will not change substantially before this next April, and that anything occurred off the base will be within the jurisdiction of the San Francisco police. Now, I am not a lawyer. I don't know what this means, but the molestations, some of them took place right at the Army Presidio base in San Francisco and at other Army bases around the United States. But when a parent leaves their child off at an Army base at a nursery school, and the person in charge gives them to a lieutenant colonel who's still in the Army, I shouldn't think it would matter where he lived or she lived if they're delivered to an officer wearing the uniform and off clothes, wearing the Satan uniform at that time, but it's under the employ of the United States government, transferred to a lieutenant colonel. I don't think that the Army should get off of this case, that it is a military case, and the San Francisco police don't have the sophistication or jurisdiction to deal with this. And Michael Aquino, besides being a full-time employee in St. Louis, Missouri, was stationed at Fort McNair in Washington, where he met people high up in military government and has held a top security clearance for many years, and worked with the Green Berets, the special forces in Vietnam, and he trained as a specialist in psychological warfare. Now, he may say we don't do satanic rituals with children off the base or at my home at all, or talk about these things, but if children go to the equivalent of a torture wax museum that he brings people to see, and he's saying that's what they saw, that's pretty much part of psychological warfare, just to go see that. And he was, according to his officers, superbly qualified to command a virtual expertise in the area of psychological operations. And the Army efficiency report said he set the highest personal standards and holds himself to those standards with his military degree. He served as a liaison officer in NATO countries. He's been a consultant and faculty member at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, a faculty member. He's a licensed security dealer registered with the New York Stock Exchange, a former employee of Merrill Lynch. Now, Merrill Lynch's chairman was Donald Reagan, former Secretary of the Treasury and Chief of Staff of the White House. Merrill Lynch, another broker from Merrill Lynch, was the gentleman who ran the bunker in Philadelphia, who was pulled in just about 4 months ago. He has his Rolls Royces and his fancy cars, and there were people tied as slaves underneath his house and bodies underneath the house. Goodness knows how many were killed. He was taken away, a very sophisticated man in a black part of town who got people who were mentally sick, who lived nearby in an institution and had a bunker mentality and activities, and sex slaves and murders. He was also part of Merrill Lynch, and Merrill Lynch has been identified with that. Steve Baum, I mentioned earlier, the Worldwide Guns and Drugs Network. This may all be coincidental, but it's interesting that Aquino, Maurice Aquino, in addition to psychological operations and NATO, and a consultant to the faculty at U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, is also a licensed security dealer for the New York Stock Exchange of Merrill Lynch. Another article from the San Francisco Chronicle Tuesday, November the 11th, titled, "Army Says the Constitution Lets Satanists Hold Top Secret Job." And this article says the high priest of the Satanic Church is protected constitutionally. The question is whether he's trustworthy, whether he can do his job in the Army, and there's nothing that indicates that there's any problem that the Army is concerned about. Michael Aquino maintains his clearance even though he performs Nazi cult rites. He describes himself as the Antichrist, is Temple of Set literature. He was thoroughly investigated before he received his security in the Army. He was reinvestigated periodically in accordance with U.S. Army regulations. And Major Greg Rickson, again quoting him, "There is no part of the liturgy of his church that causes us any security problems." He believes that the annihilation of many people is going to take place. And he wrote his own scripture. He has books that he quotes of Satan's. They're supposed to be written by experts of Satan. And he has a book, it's called The Book of Coming Forth by Night, with his Nazi philosophies in it. Aquino has conducted occult rituals patterned on ceremonies by Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler in the German castle, once used by the Nazi SS for black magic ceremonials during the Third Reich, and he's duplicating them and doing them now. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle, November the 3rd. The Nazis considered the black arts and satanic worship part of the ancient Germanic tradition. Aquino, in his book Crystal Tablet of Set, wrote that he performed rituals. He wanted to recreate an order of knighthood for the followers of Satan, and therefore he would take members of NATO and Joint Chiefs of Staff to recreate his orders of knighthood. Aquino has encouraged his followers to study the beliefs of Nazi terrorist groups, the VEM, V-E-H-M, which is very important, and the Thuls, I mentioned them last week, the Thuls Gesellschaft and the Anner Arab, two fanatic right-wing Aryan groups that existed before and during Hitler's reign, and he has his military cohorts studying, encouraging to study the Nazi terrorist groups. He makes no secret of his involvement in satanic worship. We are here for people who are seriously interested in the philosophy. The Crystal of Set is a collection of his writings. The book has descriptions of the use of lesser black magic, greater black magic, and he has classified them into the order of vampire, the order of the trapezoid, the order of the beast. The order of the vampire studies legendary vampire powers such as invisibility and powers when you are possessed by the Setians. Through our black magic in ways that are special to the children of the night, we will further enhance and develop our powers. And he has this degree in psychological operations, worked with it in Southeast Asia, taught college courses in the Bay Area, and writes books on this and takes members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This article in San Francisco Chronicle said one section of the book contains a reading list for temple members on subjects such as fascism, totalitarianism, and magic. The list refers to Mein Kampf, the Messiah, the occult roots of Nazism. Security clearances, according to the Army regulations, could be denied to people who espouse subversive political views, but he doesn't disguise his activity, and his views are not relevant to the U.S. military. They don't consider it subversive, even though Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler wrote that their goal was to take over the entire world, to have a 1,000-year Reich, to exterminate 2/3 of the world population. This isn't considered subversive, and he has books and ways for which the elite few will survive. Another story, November the 2nd, in San Francisco Examiner, Presidio Satanist, a scary enigma to observers. And he admitted in Newsweek he's a little bit scary. The article says, the Satanist is a scary enigma. He really believes he is supernatural. He has evolved in some kind of godlike being with unworldly powers. Aquino has a pale face, eyebrows that stab upward like horns of the devil, shiny black hair shaped into a prominent widow's peak over his forehead. He looks more like a 1930s Dracula than what he is, Satan's earthly lieutenant, the Prince of Darkness. That is the term that Richard Pearl uses for himself, and Richard Pearl, who recently resigned from the Pentagon to continue his satanic, and I believe there's satanic operations, in preparation for World War III that he and John Lehman, former Secretary of the Navy, talked about so much. Richard Pearl always referred to himself as the Prince of Darkness. And it'd be interesting to know if he went into any of the meetings at Westphalia, Himmler's castle, with Aquino, who came from Southeast Asia and the Special Forces and the Green Berets with very high bona fides. As I say, he's proud of being the Prince of Darkness, and so is Richard Pearl. Many Presidio officers see him and thought, wearing his black shirt, his clerical collar, and a satanic medallion around his neck, that it was a little weird, but it was okay with the military at the Presidio. Just try to get a long-haired hippie with whiskers and sandals into the Presidio, maybe eating a vegetarian meal, and they'd call the military police. But with Aquino, this is okay with them, and they know that he has a mission, and he's quite open about his mission. He is one of the Army's experts on psychological warfare, and the article in the San Francisco Examiner said that does make him a little scary. The police, the FBI, and the Army have long been curious about the activities. Why didn't they follow him? Or maybe they did to Westphalia, Germany. Aquino has not been arrested since a 3.5-year-old child recognized him, and the person who recognized him is a stepdaughter of a Presidio assistant chaplain, and described again the room and the ceiling and the wife, and who put on the men's clothing, and the men, 2 men, were with this child, and they took pictures of her in bed and sexually abused her, and also in a bathtub with some dog's feet on it, and she gave a full description. Until July 1986, he was a full-time student at the Pentagon's National Defense. Again, I've said that. In the United States, he said, just paid me the highest honor. They promoted me, Aquino said, to the post at the War College. And by sending me to that post, then lo and behold, I returned home and have this outrage that the police have entered my apartment. Aquino had a dazzling military career, the Bronze Star, the Air Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, graduated on the Commandant's List from Command and General Staff, wrote ROTC textbooks for the United States Army, retired in 1982 and was the stockbroker at Merrill Lynch, then went back to the reserves to be a teacher in charge of reserves in St. Louis, Missouri. Not only was Aquino's status reaffirmed, but he was promoted from major to lieutenant colonel, and that's what he was saying in Newsweek. They like me a lot. The city police intelligence memos in San Francisco indicate that as long ago as 1981, the authorities were noting the Temple of Set's obsession with Adolf Hitler's Nazis, that he claimed to be reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., and that a number of the Temple of the Set Satanists were in military intelligence along with Aquino, and he was reporting his activities, his Nazi activities, to the Joint Chief of Staff. Aquino shows visitors to his home in San Francisco, and I assume elsewhere, his ritual dagger. It was once owned by World War II, a Waffen-SS general. He boasts about the ritual he performed in the Hall of the Dead at Wilhelmsburg Castle in West Germany during his 1980 tour of European NATO bases. During World War II, the Westphalian Castle was the occult sanctuary for Himmler's Waffen-SS elite. He professes contempt for the new neo-Nazis. Those are the skinheads and the young punks, the new ones. He deplores them. And, of course, the Waffen-SS and their allegiance have a bloodline going back 600 years, so these neo-Nazis are simply a bunch of punks with nothing to do on the streets who can be used later, but he has contempt for them. They're not the real thing. He once urged the Pentagon in a controversial psychological warfare study entitled Mind War to overcome enemies by mobilizing every means of domestic and foreign propaganda, to include brainwashing of the entire United States public at home. He argued in a study called Mind War that there is no substitute for victory, total victory. The Mind War scenario that he's written for the Joint Chiefs and the military academic circles is a scenario that could be used as a theoretical paper and has been circulated and written for the military circles. It was not a product of Satanism. He said it's not from the Temple of Set, but a military and psychological question of how to control the minds of the entire United States population as well as the world. And Mind Wars is supposed to be a very important book written about a first Earth battalion. This is using the satellite system and the space wars. And he also had a study done for the Pentagon called Project Atlantis, a plan to beam music by the Jefferson Starship and Satanic messages from the Temple of Set to Earth from an orbiting space station. Well, Ollie North had access to orbiting space stations, and if you look at Ollie North's face or replay the tapes or remember it, he was in a sort of a star-dazed condition where if a question was asked to him and the question was only half asked, he had to whisper to Brendan Sullivan, his attorney, what he should answer, and there was indications that Ollie North had been the victim of psychological operations, and of course they both were in the special forces in Southeast Asia. And remember the memos of Admiral Poindexter to Ms. Robert McFarland of the National Security. Maybe we should send Ollie to Bethesda for a while. Right now he's been testifying before the grand jury, and Ollie North gets a question, then leaves the hall, goes out and asks Brendan Sullivan, and goes back to the room. This is the man who is holding the football that could decide the atomic bombs going off, World War III, and carrying it around with Ronald Reagan and traveling to Central America with Henry Kissinger. making important decisions for this country. Now, I wonder if Aquino's so high up with the Joint Chiefs in NATO and psychological operations and textbooks, and as I say, special forces, and a stockbroker at Merrill Lynch, how far he rubbed or how close he rubbed to the Joint Chief, to the head of the White House, the Chief of Staff, who was chairman of Merrill Lynch at a time when he was back there at Merrill Lynch. The plan, according to this report, was scuttled, his Satanic plan, because they were nervous about the killer satellite technology. And in addition to being full-time military in psychological warfare and a stockbroker at Merrill Lynch, he also studied and taught political science at Golden Gate University, and then took a few years out of the Army and went back as a lieutenant colonel working with the reserves. The reserves are the pet project of Edwin Meese and Mr. Gufrida, who set up the Federal Emergency Management, and the reserves are being trained down in Honduras and Central America, sent out of the States for the first time, and those are the people that can bring the war home by using what they learned there in the jungles and rivers to turn against us when they come home someday. This Aquino also holds a doctor's degree from University of Santa Barbara, I mentioned last week, and he was once a national commander of the Eagle Scout Society. And I have articles on the molestation of Eagle Scouts. That's been quite prominent in the news, too, but not linked to the occult, but that has been happening. Aquino, according to San Francisco, is charming, sometimes self-deprecating. He worships not so much the devil as pure intelligence. He has a high IQ, and he says Satanists are the geniuses. Those are the ones who can digest the Temple of Set's daunting metaphysical theory with their attempts to burnish the devil's tarnished public image. They want to give the devil a good name, and the geniuses are the ones to understand that the devil is wonderful and that his image has been tarnished by Christians and others. In 1968, as a newly commissioned second lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division, that's when this Aquino saw Rosemary's Baby and was enchanted by the idea of Satan. He started to attend the Church of Anton LaVey in San Francisco, the founder of the Church of Satan. In the next weeks to follow, I'll begin to connect the Manson family murders and the son of Sam, David Berkowitz also to the military establishment, the Vietnam veterans, and to LaVey and to the very people that Aquino was associating with in San Francisco. He broke off from LaVey and started his own church, and LaVey was a technical advisor to Roman Polanski for Rosemary's Baby. And then what Polanski got, he was an orphan of the Auschwitz concentration camps himself. He got his wife and baby, what seems like this would be his only baby, stabbed and killed by the Manson family, who also worked with LaVey and the Church of Set. This Satan lover Aquino works with, trained with LaVey, and then opened his own church. It's a splitter group. And one is the San Francisco scene of the occult and the various sacrifices and so forth. And he became the demon or the Satan lover of the military intelligence, which is much more sophisticated and protected than even Mr. LaVey in San Francisco. Aquino felt LaVey wasn't nice enough to Satan. He didn't believe in the devil as much as Aquino did. So he assumed the power of the Prince of Darkness and lets LaVey take care of the street people and their particular happenings. Now, there was an article in the San Francisco, San Jose Mercury, November the 4th, 1987. Presidio Care Center takes the test of the first Army scrutiny. There have been occult mutilations, I call them, of children on the Army bases all around the United States, and the only one that has so far gone to court or is going to court that has gone before a grand jury is the one in San Francisco that will be the first test case, and that will be closed down. And I believe the reason it's going so far in San Francisco and not at other military establishments is that the people in the San Francisco area are probably the most sophisticated politically and the brightest and know how to operate or move when these things happen. And while the parents of the children there are military establishment, and I mentioned one father who graduated from West Point, who had 2 children at this school, who were sexually abused in the occult ceremonies, he knew where to go and how to go about it in the San Francisco. While he may not use the street smarts of the San Francisco people, unless his back's against the wall, he knew how to use it when it came to the push and shove, because he couldn't go to the military for the protection he thought he was getting. So it was very interesting and fearful, but interesting to see this conference up in San Francisco where parents of McMartin School and parents from Gilroy and families from around the state spoke, and among them were 2 parents from the military establishment whose children had been abused with the occult. And that is far more scary if there's a scale of 1 to 10 because of seeing other children killed in front of them, hammered to death, dead animals, animals killed, threats to kill their parents, and so forth. This article from the San Jose Mercury says that there's been reported that 26 of the 242 Army daycare centers throughout the world have had problems with the sexual molestation and the occult. 26 have been reported throughout the world, including the U.S. Military Academy itself at West Point and Fort Dix, New Jersey. The Mercury News reported in August that parents at the Presidio and West Point believed the Army was trying to cover up the sex abuse, which it was, instead of making the daycare centers safe for the children. And they ordered a congressional investigation, which wasn't happening and hasn't happened. And as far as we know, Barbara Boxer is the first representative now to ask for Congress to investigate it. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article November the 5th. Satanism linked to scores of U.S. child abuse cases. Satanism and cult rituals are listed all over the country. Children 2 and 3 years old, drinking blood, seeing animal sacrifices, sexual abuses. They talked of cannibalism, eating these dead, ritual sacrifice of children. This is what they're seeing. And they said it is highly explosive, that the testimony of even small children is filled with atrocities, 2 and greater than some of concentration camps. They've been through every kind of imaginable and unimaginable torture people have gone through. And there's cases that are coming up of striking evidence of ritualized sexual abuse, case after case. This is a long article about the amount of things going on and the use of rabbits, ears cut off, black coats, capes, and also there are people, mothers who are breeders, who are having children so the children can be cut up and killed in front of them and other children. The term is breeders, if you can believe such a thing, and this is what is happening. And they're not pulling this particular man in who has all the desires of a mass genocide except for a handful. And he talks about it openly and goes through the rituals with people from the Joint Chiefs and NATO, and is still is promoted and is still a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. And they haven't yanked him back here and locked him up and chained him and made an explanation of how he keeps getting promoted with full knowledge of what he's doing in Europe and so forth. Well, I'm going to conclude this part of World Watchers and do some more on that case, because it will evolve and get much larger if people aren't afraid to come forward. The problem is that the children were told that if they tell what happened, their parents would be killed. And an example was the McMartin School, where the woman who turned in the matter, the police, was in fact killed, and killing one person throughout the country who's important. We don't know how many other witnesses are being killed to keep the children in those cities and places quiet. We only know what happened here on the West Coast, and we're lucky to know that at all. I want to conclude the program by thanking Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you the past hour of World Watchers. The previous hour of World Watchers was made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals, located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you in about 1.5 minutes or 1 minute to continue the second part of World Watchers.